Welcome to the Backstage Creative. My name is Krista Copper. This podcast features my conversations that I have with people who work behind the scenes of theater. Today, I'm excited to bring with you my conversation with costume designer Ari Fulton. Ari's fantastic. We get into a lot of really great topics. Very little about this conversation deals with costume design, which I love. I think, as different as all of our jobs are in theater, there is a lot of overlap, right? Art is art at its most basic level. And so I love these conversations when it's just about art, and it's evergreen topics that everyone can benefit from. Yeah, I don't have too much to say for this intro. So here we go. Here's my conversation with Ari Fulton. So first of all, thanks for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. And so how have you been keeping yourself busy during this time?
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning of quarantine, I was kind of aimless. Well, I was also really exhausted. I had just come off of a huge musical, and I was doing that and teaching. So I was exhausted and sort of in a way looking forward to a time to rest, because I didn't really think early on it was going to be that serious, because when in history has America ever shut down completely?
Yeah.
So I thought initially I thought it was going to be, a 2-week shutdown at most. As quarantine continued to pick up and we saw the seriousness of the illness and all of that, not just in America but around the world, it really started to sink in, and I kind of stumbled into a little bit of depression and aimlessness, just trying to figure out, okay, so if this is really going to be 6 months to a year, how do I navigate? And then also, when George Floyd was shot, that's the thing that really kind of jolted me into action and really helped me find new purpose. I think during this time period, I've been reflecting and on a journey of scholarship, and really reflecting about what kind of artist do I want to be in this new world? What kind of stories do I want to tell? What kind of lifestyle do I want to have? Because I also don't think this perpetual putting out of work is healthy. So that's what I've been doing. I've also been drinking and eating a lot, um, which is helped me get through this period. But really, it's the reflection and the scholarship, reading, painting, that type of thing, connecting with family. During this period, I spent a month in Chicago with my mom and my family, which I haven't done in almost a decade, just to be still with them and to, get to know them again, especially because they are entering their old age and they have a lot of wisdom. I've been spending a lot of time with my family and reconnecting with them and learning who they are again as they become older adults. So that has been really special and necessary during this period. I've done a little bit of protesting. However, I'm not that type of protester out on the front lines. I love the work that those activists do, and I respect it. I always say that my life is a form of protest. Just being Black, occupying white spaces, and trying to tell Black POC stories. I feel like that's an act of protest. Also, I'm a teacher. I teach at Queensborough Community College, and I also teach at University of Connecticut. During the scholarship work of exposing students to other forms of storytelling, design, art that isn't the typical classical art form. So that's sort of how I've been getting through this time.
Yeah. In all of your reading, and you mentioned like rethinking kind of the art you want to create. What revelations or what ideas have come from the work that you've been doing?
Weirdly enough, it's been sustainability. I've been, mining that a lot, but looking towards cultures that use and practice older techniques, ancient techniques. But I went down a rabbit hole of the history of indigo and just how it's not just the history of indigo, but it's the history of humanity. Indigo has really affected our nation and the establishment of our nation. So I went down that rabbit hole, and I'm really focused on sustainability because I also think that there is a direct correlation between how we treat each other and how we treat the planet. You know, we
Mm-hmm.
cannot keep treating the planet like our own waste bin and not think that it's gonna spill out socially. I think a lot of what's happening in politics, in politics and with the protests, is a direct reflection on our connection with the planet and how we treat the planet. So that's what I've really been researching. I've also been diving into African history, African art history, African art architecture, which in my past, I've not had African art history in during my time at school.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been really trying to learn that and go further in that.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that. And this may be an impossible question, but let's say like the 3 books that have been the most impactful for you that you've read, in the past several months.
It is The Flash of the Spirit. And the reason why I gravitated to this book is because one, it was one of the books that really inspired Basquiat, who is one of my favorite artists. So I was like, oh my God, I need that book. But it connects African art history with African Americans' art history and art practice.
Mm.
And I thought that that was really interesting. So I've been mining that. What else have I been reading? I reread Beloved by Toni Morrison, which is one of my favorite authors, and it's just so insightful to read that work. It's one of the books that I keep returning back to. And then I also got art history book. So this is The African Textiles by John Gilloway. And it just talks about the history, the techniques of different African textiles. It goes into batik and mudcloth, and I just think it's really fascinating. And then the other book that I'm obsessed with currently is The New Black Vanguard by Antoine Sargent. And it just talks about Black popular photography, fashion, and their impact on culture. So those are the books I've been reading. I've also picked up another book on indigo, and what is it? It's on indigo, and actually it's really on indigo and dyeing practices in West Africa, specifically Nigeria. And I got it the last time I was there, and just reading the techniques and the history has just been really fruitful during this time.
Yeah, I love that. I've been doing a lot of reading too. A lot of people have been doing a lot more reading than they normally do. So yeah, I love to hear what people have kind of, the rabbit holes that people have gone down during this time, whether it's on YouTube or books. I've been doing a lot of reading on running, which a
Ooh.
lot of that is kind of like mental strength. And so I think that's been cool to think about how I can apply like that mental discipline that you need when you're running to making music and working in theater. So um, yeah, it's been a good time to kind of nerd out about, really specific topics.
Yeah, wait, I didn't even know that there were books on running.
Oh my gosh, yeah, there's a ton of them.
Is it to like prepare for a marathon or something?
Oh yeah, there's books about like how to train for different races. There's books about like people, some people are like crazy runners that go all over the world, and so it's like stories of their travels and like the crazy runs they've done, like running across the Sahara and the Gobi Desert. And yeah, there's books about like just lessons, like Olympic marathoners, sometimes we'll write books that talk about the lessons that they've learned through training and competing. And yeah, there's a huge Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I would have not. I guess I never think to that athletes or that culture puts out books, but it makes sense.
Yeah, there's some people that have done some really crazy things in life that are just like so tough, and it's been a really good learning experience for me to hear about how they mentally handle challenges and
Mhm.
how they mentally
Mhm.
overcome really difficult physical demands. And yeah, I think we all need mental strength, and so it's been really helpful for me.
Mm.
So you mentioned that you teach too. I I have such admiration for teachers right now. I have a lot of family and friends who are teachers, and it's just it's hard right now. So what does your teaching look like now?
I feel that most of the classes I teach are lecture or critique. So, in that way, it hasn't changed that much because the format is still the same. I present the lecture and the slides. But I will say the one big thing is just checking in with students a little more and allowing them to guide me. Just taking the temperature of the room, of making sure that they're mentally and emotionally okay during that given week. I am also a tech support for helping them navigate the different platforms that we use. So that's interesting. And then also just trying to keep their attention when so much of attention is kept through being in the room and breathing the same air and being able to just like gauge through their how they hold themselves. So that's how a lot of my teaching has changed. I will say that this time has been really good to not have to worry about going on the train. That sounds very privileged of me to say, oh, I don't have to worry about going on a train and, trying to be on time. I can just roll out of bed, make some coffee, get myself together, and turn on my computer and teach a class. But not having to factor in travel has allowed me to do more scholarship
Mm.
and like really go deeper and really plan my lessons. So that's how I think my teaching has changed.
What are some of your big goals for your students? What do you hope they get from their time with you?
Storytelling, beginning, middle, and end. I hope that they really understand that and how to do that visually, because it's different. And I think our culture isn't big on that in, primary grades, high school. Like, how do you put a metaphor on stage?
Mm.
So that's one of the things I hope that they get from me during this time. And also just adapting into new forms. I'm kind of excited about what's going on with digital theater, the melding of theater with animation and other different digital forms. Because I think that there's something looking back on this once we come out of this and everyone's safe and we really beat this virus. I think that we're going to look back on this time period of scholarship and creativity. I think that the times in which creativity really flourish is when you don't have everything you need to make
Mm-hmm.
something. You
Yeah.
have to improvise. You got to be creative. So that's what I hope that they get out of this. And then I'm really pushing for them to take ownership of their own scholarship. So, yeah, I'm going to teach a lesson, but what do you want to learn? You tell me, like, what avenues do you want to explore during this time to not let this time pass you by? Because this is one of the few times in history where we can just be quiet and just focus.
Yeah. Have you been involved with any virtual performances with any theaters?
I have. I just wrapped Moliere in the Park. We did The School for Wives. This was about maybe 2 weeks ago. This was a digital production that featured Tanya Pinkins. That was a learning experience, just learning that, oh, wow, you only see this much of the frame, or, oh, wow, that's a challenge that we didn't anticipate. That, and then also, how do you conduct a virtual fitting?
Yeah.
Trying trying to explain to an actress how to tie a scarf romantically, you know? Like, how do you do that? And you're like, no, put the knot here. um, so yeah, I really enjoyed that experience. We're gonna do another one in early December, which I'm excited for. So that's the type of theater I'm working on.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like it's been effective?
Nothing compares to being in a space with an audience and the performers. That is a whole sensory experience. And I always tell the director who works on it, we're trying to fit a square into a circle. It's never going to be the theater experience that we all know and love. So let's figure out how to make something new and different and exciting. I feel like it's sort of a combination of live theater because it is broadcast live. I really enjoy reading the comments that the audience is writing in real time. However, it's never gonna be like you're in a room with the actors and the audience and you can feel their emotions and you can see the sweat, pool on their forehead, and you can smell the sweat. It's never going to be that. Do I like it? I like it for what it is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I go back and forth. Like sometimes I'll try to watch, theaters, virtual productions, but sometimes I think the ones that have been the most effective have been the ones who, go into it knowing that it's going to be different. They're not trying to
Mm-hmm.
make it like quote unquote normal. Yeah, I think theaters are starting to get better about making it almost something different, something different than trying to make it like it was, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it's
Yeah.
hard. It's hard. Yeah, we're all missing it, I think, and so that's hard to try to be forced to make something different when maybe you don't really want to.
Yeah, and my hat really goes off to the actors because they are expected to do a lot in this form of theater. Like we had to ship out 100 pound suitcases to each actor with like green screens and all of these different cords and microphones and stands. And it wasn't like they had someone setting that up in their house. They
Hmm.
had to figure out, okay, where in my house am I going to set it up? How am I going to set it up? They're doing that plus learning their lines and developing the character. Plus, then they have to deal with me telling them that they're tying their scarf wrong. So, yeah, my hat really does go off to them. Their patience and their willingness to just work with us and try to create something new.
Yeah, it's all about attitude.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear about your background, where you're from, where you went to school, if you went to school, and how you got to where you are.
Yeah, I've been actually because I went and listened to some of your past interviews, so I've been anticipating this question and really thinking about like how did I get into the business? I've been doing this for so long that sometimes I forget like how did this happen? So I grew up in Chicago during the early '90s. Really, I want to say it's four things that really got me into the business. I want to say the first is just like early '90s Chicago. This is the height of the Bulls. It's the height of the Bulls. It's the height of like this glamorizing of street culture and that type of thing. My mom worked at a restaurant owned by Michael Jordan. And
Cool.
like looking back on this, I've been reflecting on this and just how extraordinary and just kind of crazy that time was because I went to school right down the street from the actual restaurant. So I would walk myself after school to her job. And what was really interesting about the restaurant is in the bottom part was a sports bar, kind of a high end sports bar where you could watch the games. There's all these big screen TVs up. But then on the second floor, it was sort of like a high end dining room where they had white tablecloths and you can get like really good steaks and pastas and that type of thing. Sometimes I would come home, or not come home, but I would come to the restaurant and Michael Jordan would just be like chilling, doing quality control. And then Scottie Pippen would walk through, and, there would be all this buzz sometimes as I'm like walking up the back stairwells, because restaurants have all these different like secret passages that the customers aren't aware of. And so I would be hearing like, oh my God, all right, Madonna's in the dining room. And so I would peek in and see freaking Madonna and Michael Jackson and like all of these iconic celebrities. But it wasn't just the fame that drew me in, it was the glamour. It was how they fashioned themselves with the clothes, and how they created an aura around themselves with how they fashioned themselves. You think of the Bulls during this time period, wearing the boxy suits, and Michael Jordan with the gold earring and the big gold rings and things like that. I was just enamored with that. So it was that. It was also my grandmother really inspired me. She was a huge movie lover. We would sit for hours and watch films from like the golden era of Hollywood, musicals and westerns and film noirs. And so, I was just in love with glamour, just old school glamour, street glamour, any type of glamour, the clothes especially. And then the other thing is, Chicago is big on museums and art museums. So every free moment I got, I would be at the Art Institute in the Impressionist wing, just looking at every detail of the different paintings, the different artists, and just reading the labels and looking at the painting and looking at the clothes, and yeah, just going back and forth, reading the labels, looking at the painting. And then as I got older, going to the MCA and looking at conceptual art and thinking about how an art piece could embody a larger idea and create social movements. I thought that was just brilliant and just so interesting, that these different artists weren't just making beautiful paintings, but they were sort of creating a movement, telling stories, holding up a mirror to our culture. So that, and then also during my free time, I was very heavily involved in street culture, looking at a lot of my friends during this time period. Well, now we're flashing forward, so this is the end of high school, early college. The people who I was friends with, they were all like graffiti artists and breakdancers and MCs, and they had their version of storytelling and live performance, and a very dramatic way of dressing too. And I just observed, I just really took all of that in. It wasn't necessarily a conventional way in. I mean, yes, I went and saw theater. Me and my mom, we would go see the Nutcracker every year, but then we would also go see the Universal Circus. That was her thing. We have to go to the Black Circus, Ari. So, this mixing of high and low, or high and street art, I just loved it. I went to an arts high school. That really broadened my eyes to different theatrical art forms. And then after high school, I attended DePaul University, where I majored in costume design, and that sort of was a thing that really took me on my journey in the career into the career.
So then after DePaul, how did you end up in New York?
Yeah, so how did I end up in New York? So I graduated from DePaul during the recession. And so, Chicago has a huge theater scene. I did a few storefront theater productions. I interned at, where did I enter? The Goodman. Sorry, I had to think about that. It's been so long. I interned at the Goodman for a production, and I just really reached a crossing point, and I said to myself, okay, Ari, you need to go to grad school if you really want to make your career happen. And if you really want to have some sort of place in theater. First, before I applied to grad school, I also did an internship at a costume shop out here. This wasn't like a Broadway costume shop. This was very commercial. So I came out to New York before I applied to grad school. One, I came out here to intern, but also to look at different grad programs. I interned at Creative Costumes Co., which is a very commercial costume shop. Yes, they made costumes from scratch, but it was more of like a special events. What else did they do? They did a lot of television, special events, that type of thing. So I interned with them, and they really, guided me to learn the different fabric stores in New York and the garment district and all of that. And I was just so obsessed. And then while I was here, I started to shadow NYU and Yale. And it's when I looked at NYU, I was like, oh my God, this is the place for me. They are approaching design in a very similar way how I approach design, which is storytelling and really understanding story arc to create costume design. I also interned in San Francisco. I was like, San Francisco is not for me. Also, when I was younger, New York just got lodged into my consciousness of to be, an artist in New York and try to make it. I was like, I need to go to New York. So that's how I got here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I love hearing the influences that people have had, because I think that's one of the many things that makes theater so great is that we all have such different influences, and I think, man, like the storytelling is so much richer when we're all pulling from different sources, and so I love to hear that you were into like the street scene. That's cool. And then I also saw on your website that you have traveled a lot. How has that influenced your designing?
Oh, tremendously. That is my advice to any designer or anyone working in the arts or theater in general. It's so enriching to travel, because really it's through visiting other cultures that's not your own that you see how those cultures put together patterns, fabric, color, and you see how they remix those different things. You also see how they master different materials, different fabrics, or different weaves, which I think is something that every costume designer needs to see to really see how other cultures approach clothing and garments and fabrication. When I was in undergrad, I did a semester in West Africa. And the reason why I did this is because I had been in art school since I was in eighth grade. Since from eighth grade on, I had been in art school. I had been studying theater from freshman year up. So we're talking about 8 7 8 years of just really being engrossed in art and theater. However, those classes didn't really go deep into, African art practices or South American art practice. You get a little bit of Asia, but not that much. It's just China. I was bent on before I left undergrad, I really want to learn non Western forms of storytelling. So I went to West Africa. What was great about the program was you can kind of create your own syllabus and your own course materials. So I took a couple classes at the University of Lagos, and I went to different villages and learned how they, wove together kente cloth, and that was just so enriching. So it's when I went to West Africa and really started to dive into non-Western forms of storytelling that it really just opened my eyes to, breaking conventions in storytelling and in garment construction. That's really how it's helped me. And I would just say to any aspiring designers that traveling is key, to learn how other cultures manipulate fabric. And they've been doing it for, centuries. like perfecting whatever their art form is or whatever their specialty is in fabric, going there and seeing how they do it is going to enrich your design practice.
What were some of the differences that you noticed between storytelling, if that's something that you can verbalize?
While I was in Ghana and West Africa, it's very community focused. I feel like oftentimes in America and in Western practice, it has a very sterile, cold, quiet relationship between the performer and the audience, where you don't even want to rumple a piece of paper.
Yeah.
um, because then everyone looks at you with a cold look. And I feel like in West Africa, it was more of a, just sharing. It was almost like, and this is like traditional storytelling. So it was a more of a relationship between the performer and the audience member, where the audience member was sort of encouraged to interact with the performer, and I thought that that was just so freaking cool.
Yeah, I remember I did a production of Spam a Lot, and that show is so silly, and there are, like the king will like ask questions to the audience, and actors go out into the audience, and that show was so much fun because you could just feel the audience engagement, and people were quoting lines from the movie. And yeah, I it's such a richer experience, I think, when the audience is allowed to make noise.
Yes, and I hunger for it because that's how theater has always been. It's been an interaction between the audience and the performer. It's only in recent, like the last couple hundred years, that all of a sudden, we get this stale experience. I think also as we come out of quarantine and we're starting to start back into like normal life, I'm hoping that now we're gonna suck out all of this elitism that is embedded into theater practice,
Hmm.
and it's going to allow the viewer to be comfortable, to really be audible in the theater.
Hmm. So I love what you said earlier about you feel like your life is a protest. I sometimes feel that way, like as a female musician. A lot of times I'll walk into a pit and I'm like, oh, I'm the only female. Like I feel very different. Does that ever make you, when you walk into a room and you're the only person of color or only female, do you ever feel insecure about that? Have you ever questioned whether you belonged?
I've been doing this for so long, walking into white spaces, that even though I grew up in Chicago, I went to a private school from very young. So, and I was always the only black person, or the one of the few black people there. So I feel like I've been conditioned to just be in my own skin for so long that I don't even care what people's reactions are towards me. However, I think in these last couple of years it made me re-examine my conditioning and what things that I have allowed to be acceptable, like in terms of what people say to me, or, trying to, say, oh, Ari's the black urban girl. She's only going to do black shows.
Hmm.
So it's made me, feel empowered to speak up. But not just that, this last decade, I want to say, starting with the shooting of Trayvon Martin, I really appreciate the conversation that's been had online and in person, to really give me the words to express the feelings that I was feeling. Because prior to that time, it was just like, ooh, this is weird. But now you have like scholarly terms applied to that weird feeling. And now you could really dissect what part of that is weird and unacceptable and needs to be confronted. I'm always of the persuasion, I'm gonna just come as I am. You're either gonna like me or you're not gonna like me, and that's fine. I think theater again is very elite in terms
Mhm.
of like the hierarchies and all of that, and I've always chafed against that, because my idea of what makes really good art is the merging of high and low. You
Mm.
know,
Mhm.
if you look back in art history, those are the things that had profound impact are the melding of high culture and low culture, street culture, whatever you want to call it, to make something really unique and good. So I always thought that whenever I enter a room, I'm of value to that production, especially if I'm the only one. It's like, especially if you're the only one, I've always thought of myself as being of value to the production. And if anyone else has a problem with that, then that's their issue, not mine. So that's sort of how I feel.
Yeah, that's a good attitude to have. I During this time I've been thinking a lot about how can I help, other people feel more comfortable walking into rooms where they're the only whatever.
Hmm.
um
Hmm.
and like how can I mean, I'm fairly young, but how can I help kind of the next generation of women musicians feel like you belong in the pit, and here's how I can help you feel like you belong, type of thing.
Well, the thing is, the way you make them feel like they belong is if they see themselves.
Hmm.
Is if they see other female musicians in that pit, other people of different backgrounds, ethnicities, so they don't have to feel singled out or marginalized or any of that. And that's something that the theater as a whole needs to work on. And I think that we are starting to work on that. And I hope that we honor all of the dialogue and conversations that's been happening online and put it into real practice. Because I also look at those rooms and I think to myself, being in those rooms, like, why is it so hard to be diverse?
Hmm.
Like, I think of like how I grew up and the different types of people that were in my life, and it wasn't like we were seeking out diversity. It was just we were living our lives. So my question to those people who compose those rooms is, what kind of life are you living? Like,
Hmm.
your life should be full and rich and in color. And if you have to work towards this performative diversity, then you're not really living and it's not really genuine. Like, it should just be organic. It should just be people of different persuasions in a room trying to make art. Yeah, that's sort of how I feel. I mean, I feel like in order to do that, we need to have the right people making the decisions of putting together those rooms.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really well said. Do you feel like theater, so think about like New York theater, do you think that is more elite than like regional theater, somewhere else in the country or in the world?
Mhm.
Or is this kind of more of a do you see it more as a widespread than just like Broadway, for example?
I feel like all throughout America, and especially if you're looking at regional theater, it is rooted in this whole elite culture of, we know, the right type of art and the right way of storytelling. I think when you get to New York, it becomes, magnified tenfold because now there's a lot of money, but it's all the same, and I think that that's coming out of a tradition of only having certain stories being told and only having certain people in power. So I hope as we move forward that starts to change, and I kind of see it. And I think it's just going to make a way more interesting art practice.
Hmm.
I'm curious. I want to see, Latin American forms of theater, or I want to walk in and see a design team that is truly diverse, but it's an effortless diversity.
Hmm.
It's not like, oh, we plucked out, the woman, and we plucked out the black person, and we
Yeah.
plucked out the Asian, and now we're diverse.
Uh-huh.
Because I also think it goes past skin color or gender. It's a diversity of ideas, and how you see the world. If you love people, then you'll start to engage in conversation, and you start to find those people and say, oh man, that person has a really good outlook on lighting design or whatever their discipline is. I really want them on my team. I know might be a little off topic, but I started to research the Ballet Rouge, Diaghilev, who sort of put the Ballet Rouge together, and he was interesting in terms of diversity, not based on ethnicity or anything like that, but he was very proactive about getting non-theater people in the room to make theater. think of Coco Chanel was there, and Picasso was a collaborator, and he made something really unique and different. I'm wanting the new theater moment to do the same thing. Why not get an MC or somebody who is in hip hop culture to write a score?
Mm-hmm.
That would be really dope to have, like, I don't know, who would be like Black Thought or somebody to come in and, write a score to a musical. That would be really interesting. Yeah, I just think we need to break down that sentiment of elite theater, and we need to decentralize what is acceptable art. Because
Mm-hmm.
there's no reason why, a form of graffiti on a wall cannot be held up in the same way that, a great master's painting is held up. A breakdancer performer can be held up in the same way that a Broadway star is held up. So we need to really decentralize this idea of what is acceptable art.
Yeah, I mean that's going to the core of what is the purpose of art, and what role does art play in our culture? Like everyone should have access to creating art, right?
Mhm.
Like that's
Mhm.
as humans, that's what we do. Like we're naturally all artists in our own way, and so yeah, like we all need to be able to have access.
Mhm.
I like to talk to designers about collaboration and how they navigate collaboration with other people on the design team.
I've been doing it for so long that it just feels like breathing. As a costume designer, oftentimes we're just expected to do the clothes. And really, I think any designer working in theater sort of has to think as a director or think cinematically, to find the through line of the design. So my whole thing about it is I read the script, I reread the script. But before that, I think a lot of my process starts before I even get hired on a production or even know about the production. And it would just be to live life and experience as much art as possible. Just keep your eye busy looking, always looking. Like I'm constantly looking at images, looking at different forms of art. So I would say that that's really the thing that helps me in the collaboration process, is that I have a lot of tools coming into the process, like visual tools I can pull from to say, ooh, what about this? Oh, I read an article here, and I saw this image that really speaks to this costume design. But also, a lot of the designers I work with, they don't just expect me to do the clothes. It's almost like a partnership where we're trying to figure out how to best execute the story. Now, that's not all directors, and I get it, but those are the collaborations that I really like, is when the director invites me to not just be relegated to just making pretty clothes, but they're actually inviting me to be an integral part of the storytelling. So that's sort of how I approach collaboration. Also, you have to be kind and diplomatic. Theater is not a solitary art form where you're just painting a picture. It's an art form that is collaborative, and you need to be flexible on your ideas. And a lot of times when people challenge you on your first idea or whatever idea it is, there is some stock in that challenge. It's pushing you to become better in your iteration of your design. So I always like that. I always like when people are not just like, oh, that's beautiful, but they're actually inviting me to iterate on a good idea, but not a final idea.
As a musician, my favorite people to play with are the people that don't just listen to music, but the people that like go to art museums frequently, and the
Mhm.
musicians who really nerd out about like film scores. And
Mhm.
yeah, I think the artists that you get to work with that have a deeper artistry beyond visual or aural, yeah, those are the people that are just, they're so much fun.
Yeah, yeah. And then they bring in unexpected things into their craft where you're like, where'd that come from?
Hmm.
But it's because they are a well rounded, full human being that they're able to do that. And, when you talk about theater or any art, sometimes you really get wrapped up in the mastery of it and being perfect and good and all of that mastery of whatever your craft is. And sometimes it's very important to step back and experience life, all of life, the ups, the downs, all of that. Like I love going to street parades or street performances. I get so much in how those different performers fashion themselves. Especially, like, I live in Crown Heights, which has the West Indian Day Parade. And it's just so interesting and beautiful to see the different costumes that the performers are fashioning together. So yeah, I love, exploring different forms of art, culture, and life. And I bring that into my practice, or at least I try to.
I think that also helps when you're kind of feeling burned out or
Mm.
uninspired or, just kind of
Mhm.
tired of the same, like tired of the same old routine of tech week and whatnot. But yeah, I mean,
Mhm.
there's inspiration is all around you, you have to approach, it's how you approach walking through, navigating your day-to-day life.
Mhm. And hobbies too, like having something that's not related or practicing something that's not your discipline or profession. Like I will pick up some crochet needles and I'll crochet something. Something that's not necessarily design. It's still clothing related, but it's just for me and it's pleasure and it is me trying to problem solve in a different way. I think that that's very important.
Agreed. As you have gone through your career, I would imagine you've had some disappointments or failures. How do you navigate, those low moments in your career?
OMG, I love this question. When I was starting off, I hungered for this question, and oftentimes designers or artists never want to talk about failure. But I think it's so important to learn how to gracefully fail.
hmm Yeah.
How do I navigate that? In reflection, in journaling, and just really trying to dissect like where it went wrong, but also looking at it from the perspective of the other perspective. It could have been a moment where I didn't gel well with a director or a producer, and then all of a sudden it just spiraled out. And just looking at it through their perspective and seeing, okay, well, were my like how did I affect the situation? Was I being grumpy? Was I overworked and I just didn't have time to do this project and I got irritated? Trying to figure out, looking at it from a different perspective other than your own. Also, you just got to pick yourself up and try again, because especially when you're starting out, you're going to do a lot of bad. You're gonna make a lot of mistakes. You really are,
hmm
because you're learning, and it's through the learning that on the next project you're like, not gonna do that again. You learn from your failures, and I think failures are very important. It's also important in terms of like humbling yourself. It's those moments where you're like, oh wow, I'm not as good as I thought I was, or oh, I need to work on that. So I think reflection, journaling, always looking at the situation from the other person's perspective is key to pulling yourself up from a failure. And then just to create again. I think sometimes, especially when you're starting off, you get tied down to, oh my God, I'm never going to work again, or this was the worst experience. And really, you think about the universe and all of the things, the epic things that are happening in the universe, and your problems become so small. And when you think about it that way, and you can't help but to pick yourself up and try again. So I just say reflection and trying again are key, picking yourself up from failure.
hmm Yeah, that's a good perspective. I heard a quote once, and I wish I could remember. I can never remember where I hear good quotes from, but they said failure and success are on the same road. Success is just
Mhm.
further down the road, and I think
Mhm.
that a lot. Like, if you just keep picking yourself back up, how can you not eventually succeed? Like the odds are
Mhm.
in your favor that eventually you'll succeed if you just keep failing and keep going.
Yes. So, and I just hope that more successful people talk a little bit more about their failures, because I think it's important for the the younger generations to hear that. That it's not the end of the world if a show isn't successful, or yeah, it's not the end of the world if you weren't successful at your job in that moment. It's just one production, and there'll be other productions.
Normalizing failure, I think, is would be a really helpful thing to a lot of people.
Yeah, especially starting out, like you don't know what you're doing. You really don't. You think you do. And with all of your schooling and internships and all of that, you don't know, because that is all theoretical practice. It's not until you get out into the professional world without the guardrails, that you're actually putting your discipline into practice. And so you learn how to, especially if you're a costume designer, like you learn how to navigate so many different people, so many different situations with actors, negotiating the budget and expectations and time. You learn different tactics based on the different jobs you've completed and the experiences from those jobs. So you just got to keep doing it. Also, have a little humor about it, like don't take yourself so seriously. Learn to laugh at yourself a little bit and just be like, oh, wow, that was kind of a silly mistake. Definitely not going to do that again.
I I did a gig, one of my last gigs before the shutdown, and I was playing with a drummer who's pretty young. It was one of his first gigs, I think, in the professional world, and he he showed up to the gig. It was a show, and so we had done the Sunday show, and then we came back on Thursday for the Thursday show, and he had forgot to bring his cymbals with him, and he was a drummer. And so everyone's scrambling, who has a friend, who has a drummer friend who's closest to where we are right now that could let us borrow cymbals. And I looked at him and I was like, I can bet you're never going to make this mistake ever again in your life. And he's like, yeah, you're right. And then we were able to laugh about it. Like sometimes that's how you learn, is you make a really, really bad mistake, like forgetting your cymbals. And then, you'll never make that mistake again.
So true. So very true. And as long as you do the work and you're genuine in doing the work and being prepared, how bad is it really?
Yeah.
Like you don't have any ill will, or you're not a diva or anything like that. You just simply made a mistake.
And we're not doing surgery. Like
I say that all the time. Like, I say that all the time. I think so often in this profession, people take themselves way too seriously, and you're like,
Mhm.
yeah, we're not doctors.
Yeah.
How bad could it possibly be?
Yeah. Yep. Unless you're like maybe like a carpenter or something, and building a platform, then
I say
mistakes are
that too.
pretty
I
bad.
say
But
that too. I say
for
that
the
too.
majority of people involved in theater.
Yeah, I say that too. I also think that people get too bogged down on critics and like seeing what the reviews say. And I think you just have to be bold and just make something that you can stand by. And if people don't like it, then they don't like it. That's fine. You need to be excited about it and proud of it when you put it out. But you shouldn't be making art that you hope, well, I mean, not that you hope other people will like, but you shouldn't be making art specifically for critics and making sure that the critics like it. You should do something that you stand behind.
Yeah. This has been a really good conversation. I have one final question. I like to ask everyone, advice. What advice would you give to young costume designers?
Keep your eye moving, keep your hand moving. And so when I say keep your eye moving, look at as much art as you possibly can. And I'm not talking about just the art that's in the Met or established art like that. I'm talking about graffiti art and, like street performances and that type of thing. So keep your eye moving, keep reading, keep researching, keep being curious about things and people and stories, and then keep your hand moving, like keep drawing, keep sewing, keep doing anything with your hands. If you like to cook, like I like to cook, I am always baking or cooking something because it's working with my hands. So that is my one big advice, is to just keep your eye moving, keep your hand moving, be kind, be generous. So many people in this business, like I've assisted a couple people where I'm just like, a couple designers where I'm like, oh my God, they're nightmares. You should always be kind and generous to people because, it's the old adage, you get what you get out of it, what you put in. So if you're putting out negative energy, then you're going to get that back to you tenfold. Yeah, just be nice, be humble, be diplomatic, all of those things. Oh, and then the last point is keep making things. Even if it's, crap, get back on the horse and make something again. It's very important that you keep making things because that's how you become better.
The music for the Backstage Creative was improvised and performed by Ian Leroy, and the logo was designed by Zach Rimbold.